They cut down Ethan's 100-year-old oak tree without warning, a tree planted by his great-grandfather, a symbol of his family's legacy. The HOA president, Karen Reed, stood there with a smug smile, claiming it was for community safety, dismissing Ethan's protests as irrelevant. She wielded her power like a weapon, confident that no one could challenge her. But what Karen didn't realize was that Ethan wasn't just another homeowner she could intimidate. With every lie she told, every signature she forged, she left behind a trail of evidence. And when Ethan uncovered the truth, the consequences were nothing short of shocking. This is the story of how one man stood up against corruption and proved that no one is above the law. Let's start at the beginning. Ethan Morgan loved his mornings. His small, cozy home was always filled with the aroma of freshly brewed coffee, and the sunlight streamed through the windows, painting golden patterns on the hardwood floors. But what made his mornings truly special was stepping out into his backyard to admire the towering oak tree. For Ethan, this tree wasn't just a part of his property, it was a part of his family. Planted by his great-grandfather a century ago, the oak stood as a silent witness to the joys and sorrows of 4 generations. Beneath its sprawling branches, Ethan often sat with his daughter, Lily, weaving tales of adventure and legacy that left her wide-eyed with wonder. That particular morning, however, was different. Ethan woke up to an unfamiliar sound, a deafening roar that seemed to rattle the very foundation of his home. Jolting upright, his heart raced as he rushed to the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. Heavy machinery was tearing into the massive trunk of his cherished oak tree. Throwing on his jacket, he dashed outside, his slippers crunching on the frost-kissed grass. The scene before him was surreal. Men in fluorescent vests operated chainsaws and bulldozers, methodically dismantling the tree. Karen Reed, the HOA president, stood a few feet away with a clipboard in her hands, shouting instructions as if orchestrating some twisted symphony of destruction. "What are you doing?" Ethan's voice cracked with disbelief, his hands clenched into fists. He marched straight toward Karen, his normally calm demeanor replaced by fiery determination. Karen turned slowly, her expression one of practiced indifference. "Good morning, Ethan," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. This tree was in violation of HOA landscaping regulations. It posed a safety hazard to the community and was deemed inappropriate for the aesthetic standards we maintain. Ethan stared at her, stunned. "What regulations? This tree has been here for over 100 years. You can't just cut it down without asking." His voice rose, tinged with a mixture of anger and desperation. Karen raised an eyebrow, her smirk barely concealed. "Notices were sent weeks ago. You had ample time to address this. Consider this action in the best interest of the community." Ethan's jaw tightened as he processed her words. Notices? He hadn't received anything. He sprinted to his mailbox, hoping against hope that perhaps he had somehow missed it. Empty. Just as he suspected. Returning to the scene, he felt his chest tighten as the tree's once mighty branches fell one by one, the sound of their impact reverberating in his soul. "Karen, stop this!" he demanded, his voice trembling with frustration. But Karen had already turned her back, her attention now focused on signing off a stack of documents. It was clear she had no intention of listening. As the final piece of the oak's trunk was hauled away, Ethan stood there, staring at the empty space where his family's legacy had once stood. The air felt colder now, as if the soul of the backyard had been ripped away. His hands balled into fists, and a surge of determination coursed through him. "This isn't over," he muttered under his breath, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. He looked toward his house, where Lily's small face peeked out the window, her eyes filled with confusion and sadness. Ethan knew he couldn't let this go. Karen and the HOA had overstepped their bounds, and someone had to hold them accountable. As he turned to leave the empty yard, a thought struck him. This wasn't just about the tree, it was about standing up against injustice, against people who thought they could trample over others' rights without consequence. Ethan vowed then and there to fight back, not just for himself, but for every neighbor who had ever been silenced by the overreach of those in power. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, surrounded by a clutter of papers and documents. His coffee, forgotten, had gone cold, but he didn't care. His focus was razor-sharp as he scanned every line of the HOA bylaws. The warm light from the kitchen window illuminated the words in front of him, but no matter how hard he looked, there was nothing. No mention of landscaping approvals. No clause giving the HOA the right to remove trees without consent. He leaned back in his chair, letting out a long breath. Relief mingled with indignation. Karen had lied, plain and simple. That oak wasn't just a tree. It was a piece of his family's history, and she had taken it away on false pretenses. Gritting his teeth, Ethan grabbed the bylaws and headed for Karen's office. The HOA office was housed in a modest building in the heart of the neighborhood. Its beige walls and generic decor screamed bureaucratic blandness, as if it wanted to appear unthreatening. The receptionist gave Ethan a polite but clearly rehearsed smile as he walked in. "I need to see Karen," he said firmly, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. Minutes later, he was led into Karen's office. The room was meticulously organized, with a large wooden desk dominating the space. Karen looked up from her laptop as Ethan entered, her face calm, almost bored. "Ethan," she said, leaning back in her chair, "what brings you here today?" "You had no right to cut down my tree," Ethan said, stepping forward and placing the HOA bylaws firmly on her desk. "These rules don't justify what you did. It wasn't legal." Karen raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Oh, Ethan, you must have missed the amendment we passed last month. All landscaping decisions are now under HOA jurisdiction." She slid a document across the desk toward him. Ethan picked it up and scanned it. His stomach sank when he saw what appeared to be his own signature at the bottom, but a closer look told him the truth. It was a forgery. The letters were wrong, the spacing off. He had never signed this. "This is fake," he said through gritted teeth, his voice low but firm. "I never signed this." Karen shrugged, her smile turning smug. "Prove it." The audacity of her response sent a fresh wave of anger through Ethan, but he forced himself to stay calm. He realized he wasn't going to get anywhere by arguing with her here. If Karen thought she could intimidate him, she was sorely mistaken. Ethan left the office, his mind racing. If Karen wanted proof, he'd give her proof. And more. He knew just the person to help him. That evening, Ethan sat across from Sarah Linton, an old friend and a fearless journalist, known for exposing corruption. The moment he finished telling her the story, Sarah's eyes lit up with determination. "This isn't just about a tree," she said, jotting notes in her small leather notebook. "It sounds like Karen has been abusing her power for a while. Let me dig into this. I'll talk to some of your neighbors and see what I can uncover." Over the next few days, Sarah worked tirelessly, and what she found was worse than either of them had imagined. Karen had a history of forging signatures on HOA documents, strong-arming residents into paying unjustified fines and even redirecting HOA funds for personal expenses. Neighbors began to come forward with their own stories. Mrs. Jensen, an elderly widow, tearfully recounted how Karen had fined her for planting flowers in her front yard. Paul, who lived down the street, revealed that Karen had threatened to have his property foreclosed over an alleged HOA violation he had never been notified about. "Ethan, this is bigger than your tree," Sarah said one evening as they pored over the evidence at his kitchen table. "This is a pattern of abuse. Karen has been manipulating the system for years, and it's time someone stopped her." Ethan nodded, his resolve hardening. What had started as a fight for his tree had become something much larger, a fight for justice. Not just for himself, but for everyone in the neighborhood who had been silenced or bullied. Karen had underestimated him, and she was about to find out just how far he was willing to go to make things right. Ethan and Sarah wasted no time. Armed with the growing pile of evidence, they went door to door, talking to neighbors. The responses ranged from hesitant curiosity to outright anger as more people shared their encounters with Karen's overreach. Each story painted a clearer picture of a leader who wielded her position as HOA president like a weapon. At one modest home on the edge of the neighborhood, Mrs. Jensen, an elderly widow, invited Ethan and Sarah inside. The scent of lavender filled the air, and framed photos of her late husband adorned the walls. Sitting in her worn but comfortable armchair, she began to recount her experience. Tears welled up in her eyes as she spoke about the fines Karen had levied against her. for something as simple as planting marigolds in her garden. She said the flowers didn't match the HOA's approved color scheme, Mrs. Jensen said, her voice trembling. I couldn't afford the fines, so I had to rip them all out. Those marigolds, they were the last thing my husband planted before he passed. Ethan clenched his fists, his jaw tightening at the cruelty of it. How could anyone be so heartless? Sarah jotted notes, her expression hardening with determination. At another house, Paul, a construction worker with a gruff demeanor but kind eyes, shared his story. Karen had my shed torn down, he said, his voice thick with frustration. Said it didn't meet HOA standards. I built that shed with my own hands. I didn't even get a warning. Just came home one day and it was gone. As the testimonies piled up, so did Ethan's resolve. But Karen wasn't about to let him go unchecked. It started with anonymous letters, each one more threatening than the last. Drop the case, or you'll regret it, one read. Ethan found the notes in his mailbox and even slipped under his door late at night. Then came the fines, escalating charges for minor or fabricated infractions. A missing garbage bin lid, $50? A supposed weed in his flower bed, $100. It was clear Karen was trying to intimidate him into silence. Ethan refused to back down. Let her throw whatever she wants at me, he told Sarah one evening, his voice unwavering. If we stop now, she'll keep doing this to everyone. Karen's retaliation didn't stop there. She used the HOA's community newsletter to smear Ethan's name, calling him a disruptive element and accusing him of spreading misinformation. The newsletter reached every mailbox in the neighborhood, and for a moment, Ethan worried about how his neighbors might perceive him. But Karen's attempts to undermine him only fueled the movement growing around him. Sarah's investigative work had uncovered more than just personal stories. She found financial discrepancies in HOA records. Karen had funneled HOA funds into her personal accounts and falsified board meeting minutes to cover her tracks. Sarah's explosive expose went live on a local news website, and within hours, the story began to spread. This isn't about an HOA president, the article read. It's about power, abuse, and the fight of one man against an unjust system. The piece hit the community like a lightning bolt. Neighbors who had once been indifferent now began questioning Karen's leadership. Groups of residents started gathering on Ethan's front lawn to offer their support, many of them holding copies of Sarah's article. The local news station picked up the story, broadcasting interviews with neighbors and flashing damning documents on the screen. Ethan's fight had grown into something much larger than himself. The quiet man, who once cherished his oak tree in solitude, was now the face of a neighborhood uprising. And as Karen's grip on power began to slip, it became clear that her reign of intimidation and deceit was coming to an end. The courthouse was a mix of echoes and hushed whispers, a place where every word carried weight. Ethan sat in the plaintiff's seat, his hands resting firmly on the table in front of him. Beside him, Diane Hart, his lawyer, organized her notes with the precision of a surgeon preparing for an operation. Diane was known for her no-nonsense approach and razor-sharp arguments, and Ethan felt a surge of confidence just having her by his side. Across the room, Karen sat with her attorney, her usual air of arrogance now tinged with nervousness. She flipped through papers, glancing occasionally at Ethan with an expression that seemed to say, "You'll never win." But Ethan wasn't here for a stare-down. He was here for justice. As the proceedings began, Diane wasted no time. With calm authority, she laid out the facts, starting with the forged signature. A handwriting expert took the stand, pointing out the inconsistencies in the signature Karen had claimed was Ethan's. The expert used enlarged images of the document, highlighting the discrepancies in the curves and angles of the letters. "This is not Mr. Morgan's signature," the expert concluded confidently. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Diane wasn't finished. She moved on to the financial records, meticulously presenting evidence that Karen had been siphoning HOA funds for personal expenses. The court gasped as Diane revealed records showing extravagant purchases, luxury furniture, expensive vacations, and even payments toward a private construction project. Karen's lawyer attempted to object, but the judge overruled. The evidence was undeniable, and Karen's composure began to crack. When it was Karen's turn to testify, she tried to deflect blame onto her subordinates, claiming she had simply relied on their advice and wasn't aware of any wrongdoing. But Diane had anticipated this. She called former HOA board members to the stand, each of whom testified about Karen's domineering leadership style and her habit of pushing through decisions without consultation. She controlled everything, one former board member stated. If anyone questioned her, she threatened to remove them from the board. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the testimony painted a damning picture of Karen's abuse of power. The turning point came when Sarah took the stand. As a journalist, she presented a timeline of Karen's actions, tying them together into a clear pattern of corruption. Her words were methodical, yet powerful, each one driving the point home. Karen had exploited her position at the expense of her community. Finally, it was Ethan's turn. The room fell silent as he stood and addressed the court. His voice was steady, but the emotion behind his words was unmistakable. "This isn't just about a tree," he began, his eyes locking with the judges. "This is about standing up to those who think they can trample over others' rights. That tree was more than just wood and leaves. It was a symbol of my family's legacy, planted by my great-grandfather and cherished by 4 generations. It was destroyed without my consent, but what's worse is that it represents a larger pattern. If we allow people like Karen to act without accountability, where does it stop? Today, I'm not just fighting for my family's history. I'm fighting for everyone in this community who has been silenced." When Ethan sat down, the room remained quiet for a moment before the judge spoke. Her tone was firm as she delivered the verdict. The court ruled decisively in Ethan's favor. Karen was ordered to pay substantial damages to Ethan for the destruction of his property and emotional distress. She was also required to resign from the HOA immediately and faced criminal charges for fraud and embezzlement. As the gavel struck, a wave of relief washed over Ethan. Justice had been served. He turned to Diane and Sarah, offering them a grateful smile. Outside the courthouse, neighbors had gathered, holding signs of support. When Ethan stepped out, they erupted into applause, their cheers filling the air like a long-awaited victory. Karen's reign of intimidation and deceit was over. Ethan had stood his ground and won, not just for himself, but for an entire community that had suffered in silence for far too long. The fight was over, but the impact of his courage would be felt for years to come. The neighborhood felt different now, lighter, freer, as though a dark cloud had finally lifted. With Karen gone, the HOA underwent a transformation. The new leadership, handpicked by a community vote, was composed of neighbors who genuinely cared about fairness and collaboration. Monthly meetings were now open and transparent, and decisions were made with the input of everyone. Gone were the days of secrecy and intimidation. Slowly but surely, trust was being rebuilt. Ethan, however, was not one to dwell on the past. The settlement money he received was more than just compensation. It was an opportunity to heal and to honor what had been lost. Early one crisp morning, he stood in the middle of his backyard, a sense of purpose grounding him. Beside him was Lily, holding a small shovel almost as tall as she was. Together, they planted a young oak tree in the very spot where the great family tree had once stood. The sapling was fragile, yet full of promise, its slender branches reaching toward the sky. As Ethan packed the final mound of soil around its base, he felt a profound connection, not just to his family's legacy, but to the future. At the base of the tree, he placed a plaque that read, "Justice grows here." It was a simple message, yet it carried the weight of everything they had fought for. News of the tree planting spread quickly through the neighborhood, and soon a small crowd gathered. Someone suggested holding a celebration, and within days, the backyard was transformed into a lively community event. Tables were set up with food and drinks, children ran around playing games, and neighbors who had once been strangers laughed and chatted like old friends. The centerpiece of the celebration was the young oak tree. Neighbors took turns adding their own small gestures, a handful of soil, a word of encouragement. It became a symbol of their unity, a fresh start for everyone. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Ethan sat on the porch, watching the soft glow of string lights illuminate the tree. Lily was playing beneath its branches, her laughter carrying through the cool evening air. For the first time in months, Ethan felt a deep sense of peace. The battle had been hard fought, but the outcome was worth every sleepless night and moment of doubt. Sarah sat beside him, holding a cup of cider. "You know," she said, "your stories made waves beyond this neighborhood. I've been getting emails from people across the state, homeowners dealing with similar situations. They're inspired by what you did." Ethan smiled, his gaze fixed on the tree. "It's not just my story," he said. "It's everyone's. No one should have to face this kind of injustice alone. If my fight helps others stand up for themselves, then it was worth it." In the weeks that followed, Ethan's story spread even further. Local news stations picked it up, framing it as a victory for the little guy against unchecked power. The story became a rallying cry for homeowners everywhere, a reminder that no one, no matter how powerful, is above accountability. For Ethan, life returned to a quieter rhythm. The young oak grew steadily, its leaves rustling softly in the breeze, a constant reminder of what had been lost and what had been regained. And for the neighborhood, the tree stood as a beacon of hope, proof that even in the face of adversity, unity and determination could create something beautiful. As Ethan watched the seasons change, he knew one thing for certain: justice had taken root here, and its branches would continue to reach far and wide,